Good afternoon, scholars. It's good to be with you today. As you know, this is our week 6 live session, and this makes for the last live session of the course. I hope that it's been very insightful to you and giving you an opportunity to learn a lot about business ethics. And we're going to continue our examination of ethics by examining one of the biggest hot button issues in the at least in the political arena, that often bleeds into business, and that's the idea of justice, social justice, and the things that we consider important in the realm of determining how corporations should go about exercising any responsibilities we believe they have in the realm of social justice. So the first thing that we need to consider is that justice is a part of morality. Depending upon your point of view, justice can have a very broad view, a very narrow view. But usually talk of justice and injustice generally involves appeals to the related notions of fairness, equality, what you deserve, and the rights that we have. The main focus of justice as it relates to corporations is the idea of economic or distributive justice, because we're focused on how we're going to appropriate at society's assets for distribution to society as a large, to society as a whole, I should say, and also the burdens that come with wealth, income, status, and power. So when it comes to the idea of social justice, we see that not only is it takes into account how we should go about distributing wealth, but it also takes into account what are the ultimate outcomes that we seek to establish with our redistributive efforts. Economic distribution may be purely based on equality, need, effort, social contribution, or merit. Each of those principles are plausible in some circumstances, but not others. So when it comes to trying to determine what is just, and how do we best define social justice? In some situations, the principles that we're examining may pull us in different directions. So we can grow dissatisfied with pluralistic approaches because some moral philosophers have taught us that we need to develop more general theories of justice. In other words, we need to not be so specific in what we determine as equality and justice, and be more broad-minded. The idea behind that is to be more inclusive of people, regardless of the circumstances that we're addressing. Now, one of the main ideas behind social justice and how we distribute wealth is utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism argues that the maximization of happiness ultimately determines what is just and unjust. In other words, John Mills argued that, more specifically, the concept of justice identifies certain important social utilities, that injustice involves the violation of rights. Therefore, we're arguing basically from a utilitarian point of view that that we need to focus on those things that makes folks happy. We need to focus our attention in its simplest form on what pleases people and what gives them the perception that their lives are better. And to that end, we need to do what we can to address the violation of rights that we believe others have held and have done against others. So the utilitarian is going to take the approach that in order to distribute wealth, we need to do what's going to make the most people happy. Even if that happiness involves what we see today in our political realm, not really being honest about the ultimate effects of certain definition of social justice. So utilitarians examine a number of factual issues in order to determine for themselves which economic system and principles will best promote social well-being or happiness. So that leaves a lot to the subjective intent of the person seeking utility. So most utilitarians favor increased worker participation and more equal distribution of income. So for the utilitarian, it just comes down to money makes you happy. And we know from our own Christian beliefs that that the love of money is the root of all evil, that the love of money is what causes most of the problems that we see in society. Well, the utilitarian believes that those problems could possibly be resolved by more money, by more equality, but that's not always the case. Another theory that that's often used to further social justice idea is the libertarian theory that identifies justice with liberty. In other words, the more freedom you have, the more freedom you have from the intrusion of government, the better off society will be. So libertarians reject the utilitarians' concern for total social well-being. Their main concern is, are you able to do whatever it is you want to do? And we see that that's not always plausible. That's not always plausible, because doing what you want to do may clash with someone else's rights. Robert Nozick, the noted libertarian philosopher, defended the entitlement theory because he argued that the distribution of goods, money, and property is just if people are entitled to what they have. Basically, if they have acquired their possessions without violating the rights of someone else. So basically, it would be capitalism taken to extreme, because it would take into account, it would not take into account any benefits or any advantages you received in order to get that property. It would just look to determine, were there any laws violated? Was there any civil laws violated? And our definitions of right and wrong can be very fluid depending on our perception. Just because someone is not sued or arrested doesn't mean that rights were not violated. So libertarians generally operate with a distinctive concept of liberty. They defend free exchange of ideas and laissez-faire markets without regards for the results to the same degree that we see other forms. Their focus is always freedoms. They always focus on, are you free to do what you want to do? And really the negative consequences that can come from that are only negative as you define them. Now, John Rawls, he countered that. He approached the idea of social justice within the social contract edition. He argued that to imagine people meeting in the original position to choose the basic principles that are to govern society. So that basically the original position is just that place where we're all equal and we have to determine what's best for society as a whole. As a result, Rawls contended that any principles agreed to under these circumstances have a strong claim to be considered principle of justice. In other words, what we as society have agreed to as the rules, those should be the rules or the principles of justice. And he further argued that people in that original position would follow the maximum that I just laid out for rulemaking. They would choose principles guaranteeing that the worst that could happen to them is better than the worst that could happen to them under any rival principles. So basically, according to Rawls, people look for the least worst possibility to happen. They are, and he rests his theory on two principles. First, each person has a right to the most extensive scheme of liberties compatible with others having the same right of liberties. In other words, whatever I should have the right to do, you have the right to do. And his second principle is that states, to be justified, any inequalities must be of the greatest expected benefit for the least advantage and open to all under the fair equality of opportunity. In other words, if people are going to exploit equalities, then those exploitations and those opportunities have to be minimized or maximize the greatest expected benefit for the fewest people advantage. In other words, if there's an advantage to be taken, only the fewest number of people should take it. Now, because of his ideas, he rejected utilitarianism because he argued that it would allow an unfair distribution of burdens and benefits. And contrary to the entitlement theory, he argues that the primary focus of justice should be the basic social structure, not transactions between individuals. Therefore, he focuses more on society as a whole, more of the collective rather than your individual rights. Uh, so to that end, he's going to argue that society is a cooperative project for mutual benefit, and that justice requires us to reduce the social and economic consequences of arbitrary natural differences among people. In other words, Rawls is trying to say we need to make things as equal as possible because we can't leave things with the individual. Now you see how far antithetical that is to something such as libertarianism, where in libertarianism, individual liberty is the hallmark of their belief. Individual liberty must be protected. But Rawls argues that individual liberty takes a back seat to the collective. So as a result, when we look at the various theories that relate to justice and economic distribution, a lot of what we believe should be a lot of the ideas that we believe should be adopted, they're going to be taken from our own experience. What's pushing us politically, what's pushing us to achieve what it is we want to achieve. And as a result, you see what we have today in our political arena, where you have some people on one extreme and other people on the other extreme, and really everyone in the middle is falling by the wayside. So when it comes to social justice and economic justice and how we distribute wealth and what we need to do, we understand that the concept of justice is fundamental to any discussion of how society ought to be organized, and questions of justice inevitably come up when we consider the unequal distribution of income and wealth in the United States and in other areas. But when we really look at things from the ethical standpoint, do we want a system where we're sacrificing our individual liberties for the benefit of a government mandated equality? Because remember, whatever the government gives, it can take away. So if it ensures that you're equal to everyone else, at some point the government can come in and say, well, we don't need that equality anymore. And as a result, whatever you've gained, you could lose. So then we move on to our next area of discussion, and that relates to how do corporations fit into all of this? How do corporations, what should we expect of corporations when it comes to what their role in social justice? We have to remember that the modern business corporation has evolved over centuries, and incorporation is no longer a special privilege it once was. Corporations have enjoyed a special status because we have believed that corporations are inherently good, so they're worthy of protections. So corporations are legal entities with legal rights and responsibilities, but not identical to those enjoyed by individuals. And one of the things that we wanted to do with these corporations, we wanted to protect various stakeholders. So business corporations are limited liability companies. And and that's because their owners or stockholders are liable for corporate debts only up to whatever they invested in the business. In other words, corporations, the idea behind corporations, that we want to encourage people to put their money on the table, to invigorate the economy, to expand through technology, through research and development, to expand their ability to be profitable. And to that end, we want to shield some of their liability. And there are hundreds of examples of where this comes into play, where corporations have been sued, but stockholders and officers were only liable up to a certain extent. Excuse me. So the question of corporate moral agency has been whether corporations are the kind of entity that have moral responsibilities, because we are concerned about encouraging businesses and trying to protect people who are seeking to start businesses and add to the economy, create jobs, etc. We have to ask if corporations can make rational and moral decisions the way people do. If they can, then they can be held morally blameworthy or praiseworthy for their actions. Now, philosophers disagree about whether corporate internal decision structures make it reasonable to assign moral responsibility to corporations, because just because one level of decision making has occurred, it doesn't mean that there are other levels that won't get made. And when a decision finally does come down, well, at what level is there absolute responsibility, especially if a rule has been whittled down, changed, and modified at various levels? So when we're dealing with who should we hold accountable, it becomes a very challenging situation in certain instances. And that's one of the reasons why we've held that corporations should be protected from the idea that they have a moral responsibility. And the problem is further compounded by the difficulty of assigning more responsibility to individuals inside the corporation. Because just because the CEO is running the office, that doesn't mean that he knew what a group of people were doing at the lower levels of the organization. One instance comes to mind is Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, they were accused of that some of their sales representatives were creating false accounts in the name of actual account holders in order to increase their sales and to increase their salaries related to those sales. And as a result, the securities, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the the FTC, all moved against Wells Fargo, and they sought to hold certain of the people accountable. But the question arose when they had to determine to what extent do we hold the board of directors responsible or officers responsible when all the things that were done were at a lower level and they didn't know what was going on at that lower level. So that's an example of what we mean, that how do we assign more responsibility when there's so many levels and so many concerns about about who's responsible and how much culpability they have. And despite those controversies, courts and the general public find the notion of corporate responsibility useful and beneficial to society. So what the courts have found and what the general public accepts is that we do expect for there to be some type of obligation for individuals of the corporation to a certain extent. They do accept that. So therefore, the debate over corporate responsibility is whether it should be construed narrowly to cover only profit maximization or broadly to include acting morally, such as refraining from socially undesirable behavior and contributing actively and directly to the public good. Now, one of my favorites to talk about is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is a Nobel Prize winning economist who worked with President Reagan and the late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And basically, he argued that corporate social responsibility is basically a corporation maximizing its profits. Milton Friedman contended that diverting corporations from the pursuit of profit makes our economic system less efficient. Business's only responsibility is to make money within the rules of the game, and private enterprise should not be forced to undertake public responsibilities that properly belong to government. In other words, it's not a corporation's responsibility to choose winners and losers. If anyone's going to do that, it should be something other than businesses. And as long as businesses are doing what they're inherently called to do, which is make money, they're creating the biggest benefit for society because they're creating jobs, they're maximizing those jobs, they're creating more return for investors, which is encouraging more investment. So those like Milton Friedman understand that if you ask a corporation to work beyond itself, you're going to end up with wasted money. And that's what you don't want corporations to do. They're not in the business of wasting money. They're in the capitalist system of basically gaining capital, making people rich, making investors rich, and making societies rich. However, defenders of a broader view maintain that corporations have additional responsibility because of their great social and economic power. They argue that business is governed by an implicit social contract that requires it to operate in ways that benefit society. And you may have remembered this from these statements made by Barack Obama and Elizabeth Warren, where they argued that because the governments, whether they be state, local, or federal, built an infrastructure in which a business operates, they argue that the business really didn't build itself, that government had a greater hand in building that business. As a result, the business has a greater responsibility to do more than it does, which includes paying more taxes than they do. So they argue that corporations must take responsibilities for not just what they intend to do, such as making profits and maximizing their business avenues, but they also have to take responsibilities for unintended side effects of their business transactions, what we call externalities, and weigh the full social cost of their activities. In other words, they want social justice warriors within the corporation. The problem with that is you get corporations that begin to take sides. And through various times in history, we've seen corporations coming down on one side of a social issue versus another, whether it was with gay marriage, whether it was with the current abortion law debate in many states. You have corporations being forced to alienate some of their consumers to benefit other consumers. So it's basically creating an inefficiency where you're telling certain consumers, yeah, we'll give you your money, but we don't care what you think, while we are embracing what others think. So at what point morally does a corporation have to examine the ideas that it supports or rejects in the furtherance of its business model? And that's what Milton Friedman criticizes. Why are we asking businesses to take a political stake in something when that's not what they're called to do? Because that ultimately hurts the business and hurts consumers as well. Now, advocates of the narrow view, like Milton Friedman, stress that management has a duty to the owners of the corporation, its stockholders, and those take priority over responsibility and obligates it to focus on profit maximization alone, because that's what a business is inherently called to do. But those who challenge that argue that because they argue that they fear the damage that can be done from a narrow focus on profit maximization. They feel that if you just focus on profits, you'll lose sight of what's happening in society. And they also argue that they see nothing absurd in requiring corporations to have a broader view of social responsibility. But the problem with that is, do you define social responsibility? Is it defined as in encouraging the view that you let people do whatever they want to do? Or is it defined in the idea that we should embrace a notion of morality and a foundation of that morality, whether it's in religion, whether it's in faith, etc.? And those who challenge men like Milton Friedman also argue that they don't think that management stockholder relationships forbid people from taking moral considerations seriously other than profit maximization. But the problem with that is, how do you define what's moral? If your definition of morality is to allow and encourage people to do whatever feels good, well, then you're going to alienate a large group of people who believe, as we do, that our faith comes first. So do you understand that when we take the position that men like Milton Friedman have lost sight of what a corporation really should do, when you embrace the idea that corporations have a greater responsibility than doing what they're skilled at doing, you're really telling a corporation to only adopt views of morality and views of right and wrong that comport with only a particular group of society. You're asking businesses to choose side, alienate not only certain stockholders, alienate not only consumers, but alienate large sections of society that ultimately can end up hurting the corporation. So to counter those three ideas, there are three counter arguments to those who would argue against Milton Friedman's position. First, the let go and let government do it idea is one, and the narrow view that there is a invisible hand argument, in addition to the third idea, which is business can't handle it argument. Now, the idea behind each of these is that in the invisible hand argument, there's something that's always operating that we can't see that ultimately ends up creating the benefit. Second, in the idea of let government do it argument, basically they're arguing is that profit maximization is best left to corporations, and whatever governments should be called to do, corporations should stay out of that. And then also we have the idea of business can't handle an argument. And basically is some issues are so big that it's unfair to ask a business to address it. And this is the problem with the social justice warriors and their view of corporate social responsibility, because all three of these arguments have flaws in them. And the basic flaw is that you're endorsing discrimination. You're asking corporations to discriminate against not only their stockholders, not only people in society, but to discriminate to the point where that discrimination can ultimately harm the corporation. Now, those proposing broader corporate responsibilities see the creation of an ethical atmosphere within the corporation as an important first step. And essential to that atmosphere is the acknowledgement that there is a critical importance of ethics, encouraging moral responsible conduct by all employees, recognizing the pluralistic nature of our social system, and openness to public discussion and review. But again, what set of morals and rules are we starting with? That's the key thing. You have some in society today that would look at Hobby Lobby, that would look at Little Sisters of the Poor and Chick-fil-A and say that their faith-based approach should be rejected, that they should not be worthy of acceptance because it's that they're not accepted by anybody, and they end up alienating some. But remember, these are private corporations. They're not government. And when you look at the Constitution is about one thing, mainly, limiting the power of government. Just because the government can't stifle our speech doesn't mean a private employer can't. As a result, those who argue for this broad view of corporate social responsibility show not only a disdain for the Constitution, but a breathtaking misunderstanding of the Constitution. And so often that misunderstanding of the Constitution can be seen in many of the decisions wherein courts are ruling where the Constitution is silent, where they don't leave it to the states, where they're imposing upon states and private businesses ideas that only a few non-elected judges want to embrace. One of the things that Christopher Stone argues in relation to this, he argues that corporations and the people who make them up must have high moral standards and monitor their own behavior, because there are limits to what the law can do to ensure that business behavior is socially and morally acceptable. And that argument is rejected by those who neither understand the Constitution nor appreciate the freedoms that we have as a result of that Constitution, as a result of the natural law model. So one, the law tends to only be passed after the damage is done, and two, formulating the laws and regulations are often too difficult, and three, enforcing the laws and regulations is often too difficult. So we have three reasons right there that the more we expand this idea that corporations have a moral responsibility, the more you're going to have to expand government. And I'll give you another example. When you look at net neutrality rules, this argues that all people should be treated equally in the realm of internet. But the problem with that is that creates the need for more government. It creates the need for there to be a bigger watchdog over the public sector in an effort to further the demands of government. And that's not how our system is set up. That's just not the way our system is made. We also have to remember that all settled economic life requires trust and confidence. The adoption of realistic and workable codes of ethics in the business world can actually enhance business and efficiency. And that's particularly true when there's an imbalance of knowledge between the buyer and seller. In other words, when you encourage morality, when you encourage them doing things right, you're encouraging businesses not to take advantage of their power position where they have more information or more ability to affect the change. So there are various ways that you can improve organizational climate so individuals reasonably can be expected to act ethically. One way is to adopt an ethical code. Another way is to set up high-ranking ethics committee, and then include a mandatory training for their employees in employee development programs that are directly targeted at ethics. So as we wrap up the course, these are going to be some of the foundational principles that you have to remember as you go forward in dealing with your considerations of ethics and how you want to go about as a human resource professional, determining how your corporation can be more ethical, be more reasonable in its approach. Again, as always, even though the class is ending, if you have any questions, please contact me, send me an email, give me a call. I'm always here for you. I certainly hope that you've enjoyed the course. And I wish you the best of success in your future endeavors. And as always, in all you're getting, get understanding, and wisdom is the principal thing. God bless you.